Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Nathan Gorman, the 24-year-old British heavyweight, is on the comeback trail, having been confirmed in a fight for September the 12th against Richard Lartey. So this will be on the undercard of an Anthony Yarde fight. So this is an interesting one for a few reasons, not least because both of these guys, Gorman and Lartey, they're both coming off losses to Daniel Dubois from 2019. So Lartey having been stopped in 4 rounds in April of that year, and then Gorman a few months later in July 2019 stopped in 5 rounds. Dubois coming through those with decent performances in both, especially the Gorman one. Remembering that was a fight where Gorman was expected to be relatively competitive, but it ended up being a case that he didn't really fire a shot. He tried to sort of go to war with Daniel Dubois. He sort of didn't rely on his boxing and his movement and skills. He decided to try have a scrap with him, and it did not pay off. Didn't look great in that fight. His reach of 73 inches, he just couldn't sort of land those left hooks he was trying to throw, quite often in that fight, falling short. Daniel Dubois behind the jab picked him apart. He was the one that looked like the boxer. Ultimately stopped him with some good power shots, took him out in the 5th round. And since then, Gorman has been out. And you sort of got the feeling, that he would come back maybe the end of 2019 and, start making his way back in the heavyweight division, but he opted to take a bit more time out. Some of it more recently has been enforced because of the pandemic, but he has spoken about needing to take a bit of time away for himself, get away from the sport, to step back for a bit, sort of reassess what he was going to do, his next steps, and clearly he's done that and he's ready for action now that boxing is back. In Richard Lartey, he's got a guy who is 14-2. That lost to Daniel Dubois being his last fight. But Lartey in that one actually looked, I think, better than people were expecting he would. Remembering it was a guy that basically there was no footage of him floating around, or very little of it, I should say. And what we did sort of know was he was a bit of a come forward. He looked like he'd be a fun fighter, throwing shots, had looked to have decent power. And we saw that on display in that Daniel Dubois fight, even landing a couple of shots at one point, backing Daniel Dubois up momentarily, getting him to sort of actually reassess, reset, and not just sort of try to walk through him, because obviously that's what they started trading and having a bit of a war in there. So he was taken out eventually. Daniel Dubois' power sort of brought him home, and the skills, he was able to get Lartey out of there, as he did Gorman. But this one, it's a bit of a litmus test for me about where Gorman is really at, because Richard Lartey, he's pretty crude and rudimentary. We know what he is and what he isn't, but he does have some pop, and he probably has seen that fight from Nathan Gorman against Daniel Dubois, and will be thinking, actually, I've got a shot in this fight. If he can come forward, swarm Nathan Gorman and try to really put it on him, who knows what could happen. I guess there is a question about Gorman's chin, stopped by Daniel Dubois, but I guess that's not something to, really hold against him, because he is a big, big puncher. So we'll get maybe a better indication of where Gorman is at in terms of the chin and a few other factors, and maybe his place in the division. Because I think on the strength of that performance against Daniel Dubois, some people on their sort of where they were rating and ranking fighters maybe just downgraded Nathan Gorman and thought, actually, he's not where I thought he was. So this is a chance for Gorman to reintroduce himself, make a bit of a statement if he can, but he needs to go in here and look good. I actually think he'll go back to what he's done before in fights like against Kevin Johnson, Razvan Kajanu. He will look to use his skills, his boxing, rely on the ability that he does have, because he's actually a decent technician. And some of those fights weren't the best in terms of watching, but he was effective and, comprehensively outboxed guys like Kevin Johnson and Razvan Kajanu, over 10 and 12 rounds respectively. I think he will want to have a look at Richard Lartey. I don't think he's going to be super aggressive, knowing that this guy's probably going to come forward and swing for the fences and maybe potentially tire as the fight wears on, bearing in mind this is a 10-round fight. And for Richard Lartey, what's he got to lose? No one's really expecting much of him. No one was expecting terribly much in the Dubois fight. And actually, I think he came better than advertised, whereas sometimes, they don't. Remember, Ebenezer Tete was also another Ghanaian. He came over, fought Daniel Dubois, and looked absolutely dreadful. Richard Lartey sort of emerged from that fight with a little bit of credit. But maybe he can be a guy who's in these sorts of fights, he can be a bit of a gatekeeper for guys that do have some ambition to be progressing into that sort of top 30, top 40 level. Because at the moment, where is Nathan Gorman? Would you say he's somewhere between top 50 and top 100? Possibly, yeah. I don't really know where he sort of sits at the moment because I need to see more. It was no disgrace to lose to Daniel Dubois, but it's a shame that we haven't seen him since. So what he does and, how he does it is going to be important in the way that people sort of see where he is in the division and sort of get a flavour of where he's going. Because I think we can make a case that, he's in this Frank Warren stable, and I don't actually think that he's been terribly well looked after, because we know that Daniel Dubois is the golden child in that stable. Gorman has kind of been a little bit of an afterthought and often thrust into fights at short notice, etc. It doesn't really seem like there's been a plan. So I hope after that first loss, there is going to be a bit of a plan for him and what he's going to do. But what I could see potentially is a Joe Joyce fight in his future. And with Joyce, Dubois and Gorman being in the same stable, and remembering you've got a few other guys that are there too, like Alex Dickinson, you also have David Adelaide, but they're a bit sort of further back. But in terms of Gorman, Frank Warren might have some plans in mind that, look, if Joe Joyce fights Daniel Dubois and loses to Dubois, as I think Frank Warren is hoping he will, that he could still make an in-house fight between Gorman and Joyce. I could totally see that being on the cards at some point. But I guess some of that may down the line depend on what is Joe Joyce's promotional sort of commitments and contract with Frank Warren, because he has moved around a bit. He's also had a number of trainers. He hasn't really sort of stayed still for too long in any one place. And would he want to, on the back of, say, if I'm just sort of throwing this out here, if he did lose to Dubois, and I'm not saying that happens, but if he did, would he want to necessarily go into a Gorman fight? I don't know, maybe that could be seen as a real rebuilding fight, but at the same time for Gorman it's also a chance to prove that he's at that certain level. But I guess I'm sort of getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'm just sort of ruminating on the what next should Gorman win, because if he is good enough, he should take this one and probably have a decent sort of wide margin on the cards, because there is a question with Gorman how much power he's got. So if he's to win this one, I expect it's going to go 10 rounds. And I think Richard Lartey, after about 4 or 5 rounds, is going to be starting to puff quite heavily. I don't expect that Nathan Gorman's going to take him out, but, it could happen. But there is a question about the power. But I think Richard Lartey, in the first few rounds especially, is going to be dangerous. I think he'll come after Nathan Gorman at times. I think he will fancy his chances. Lartey is going to be the guy in this fight that's actually going to have the reach advantage, 77-inch reach, so he's got a 4-inch reach advantage, but also he's a couple of inches taller. They list Gorman at 6'4.5", but clearly that is not true, because Daniel Dubois is about that height, and clearly against Dubois, Gorman was a couple of inches shorter, so maybe 6'3" at best. But I don't see Richard Lartey using the reach and the height to his advantage. I think he's just going to come in and do what he does and throw a lot of punches and try to, inflict some damage that way. But I like this fight. It is sort of interesting for a number of reasons. But what do you think of this one? Nathan Gorman and Richard Lartey. And what are you expecting of Gorman? I think, for him to have any sort of ambition of competing at a high level in the division, he's got to win, and I think he has to win well. I think if he sort of scratches sort of past Richard Lartey, even if it is slightly wide, but he looks, pretty pedestrian, I don't think a lot of fans are going to be calling to see him in some big fights. But yeah, what do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.